I like to see the way that people's brains align, and this group really understands the game. They understand the developmental processes, and they understand the detail-oriented components. In having conversations with the other coaches, I hear the same things reiterated over and over again, which is something that I notice, and I find it very important. Because in today's environment, one of the things that we see is you're constantly getting information thrown at you, right? It seems like too much information all the time, so you can only take a little bit in and retain it. What I want to talk about today is identifying the key elements, focusing on those key elements, being detail-oriented, and having the exact outcome that you want. Because there's lots of work that we put into things, time, effort, engagement, but we don't always get out of those things what it is that we thought we would for the time and effort, which means we're doing something wrong. So I want to try and identify those areas to facilitate the best outcomes in the shortest periods of time, okay? One of the key things that I want to talk about, though, particularly for this age group, is going to be around the word development. What does development mean? Well, as coaches, we identify a player, we identify those strengths and those weaknesses that we see relevant, and then we look for how we can make positive changes so that they can best adapt in the situation to help us get wins, right? But when we talk about development, you're working in a very special age group because you've got two things to consider. One, you have the experience of the player, the time that you have with that player, and the maturation process by which you can develop skills. They, though, are also going through developmental processes physically. And so this is where some of the challenges come into play, because those of you particularly that are working with the under 16s see that there are people that are at different maturation cycles, right? Or is everybody exactly the same? You have some that one year they come in and they're at a certain height, and the next year they come in that are a totally different height. Now the physics of all that changes, right? Because now they have to adapt to a new body. When you work with the athletes that are 18, 19, 20 and up, they've already basically established their physical mass, and now it's much easier for them to understand their natural physics. But when you're working with under 18, each year there's going to be different components that they're going to have to deal with. It could be different heights, different weights, different strengths are coming about, and they're developing in different speeds. So that tells us we have to decide what our focus is going to be. A common error, particularly in my field of strength and conditioning, but it happens in all coaching, is they don't put enough focus in the particular aspects of what's necessary to move to the next level. I work at the University of Miami, and I run the graduate program for strength and conditioning. So I'm involved with the strength and conditioning every day, and I'm involved with the coaches. And one of the things that I commonly see is we get athletes at 18, 19 years of age to start, and they're generally at the readiness for next level. And so what I like to see when people come in and we talk about development, if I see you here and I've got a period of time by which I'm going to work with you, I'm going to expect a linear improvement in what I do. What I see, at least in the United States, but I know it goes on at the international level, is people will come in at a set level, and there's no guarantee that they're going to meet this. What happens is a lot of times it does this, rather than having a linear relationship. And one of the reasons that happens is they weren't developmentally ready. Then we apply these harder, more intense, greater volumes upon them. Some succeed to a better degree, others start to fail due to injuries or imbalances and those other things, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Because one of the things that you can do is set the greatest foundation for this age group, which allows you to take it to the next level. Now, I spent 10 years with the under 18s, and I've spent 10 years with the over 18s. So I know across the developmental cycle where the needs are. One of the most common errors that coaches do is they try to train young people as if they're more mature people. they try to put too much into their practices and too much into the knowledge base and skill sets of the young people rather than focusing on the foundational skills. Which brings up my next component. And you've heard this word over and over again, and this is what I was alluding to before with the other coaches. Development-focused detail. The detail is the key. I'm going to show you a bunch of exercises tomorrow, and they're going to be categorized. Some are just going to be related to making your body function better. Others are going to be related to making your body function in a manner that allows it for greater performance. We can go through the acts of doing things, but if we're not detail-oriented, all we're doing is burning calories. Same thing happens on the court. If you're not detail-oriented in the crispness of movements, in the specifics of how each engagement occurs with the different plays and within the different players, you will have movement on the court, correct? But does that mean that you have the execution that you're looking for, which then will transition into game performance? So details is going to be a component that I'm going to talk about too. And this one is the one that everybody's most surprised with. Too much work. So there's two problems here. One is I've got a period of time that I can use, but I try to cram too many things, okay? Particularly when working with the under 16s, you have to pick a number of activities or specific skills that you're trying to develop and focus on those. Do not try to cram a whole bunch of things in a short period of time. Two, just because you have 2.5 hours doesn't mean that there needs to be 2.5 hours of physical work. Do you know how much energy you have in your body to manage physical work? How much time can you go? Any guesses?
90 minutes.
Say it louder. 90 minutes is an excellent answer. Don't get too close over there. One of the reasons for the 90 minutes is because of the amount of sugar your body's able to maintain inside itself. Once you deplete to a certain point, you're getting negative returns. So the 90 minutes of actual work stems from continuous activity. But the problem with 90 minutes is I can't get high levels of performance over that period of time. Because what's going on each minute? What are you losing? You're losing energy, right? So one of the things that I'm also going to talk about is getting quality of work in a shorter period of time. Can you teach without burning calories? Can you get people to do things without burning many calories? Say yes. That's the educational part. So one of the things that I want you also to think about is you don't always have to have movement to get knowledge. Okay? If you can get a player to better understand what they're doing, you don't have to do as much movement in application to grab that knowledge. Now, when we talk about strength and conditioning, we have a whole other situation. Because this has been my experience, is we do a lot of work on the basketball court, and that burns a lot of calories, but then we still want them conditioned, right? So when do we do that? Now you're talking about a time that would be optimal to separate it, right? Because you only have 90 minutes. But how many of you have the time or actually the resources by which you can do conditioning, appropriate strength and conditioning, albeit muscle balance, whatever it is, plus all of your basketball skill work? Do you have enough time in the day? Do you see the issue? So what we're going to have to do is be very strategic. When a person becomes fatigued, their body's ability to function declines relative to the level of fatigue. When we see 90 minutes, what happens is to the detail specificity of your movements, your nervous system can't work as well. Because your nervous system runs on sugar, can only run on sugar. So if you're running out of fuel, the proficiency is going to be limited. One of the questions that sometimes comes to me from coaches is, hey, should I work them out before we practice so that they're used to playing tired? Or should I work them out after practice so that I can put my emphasis on basketball? What do you think my answer is? What's the goal? What's the goal, right? In most cases, I say if they're there for basketball practice and basketball is what we're there for, then put your effort and detail-oriented work into those skills. If, though, they're tired, does it make sense to really work them hard after those particular basketball practices? Say no. One of the worst things you can do. You don't get better when you're doing the work. That's when your nervous system learns, but your body has to recover after the work, okay? And what happens is, if we get too much, instead of being able to use that linear increase, we get this varied product and a higher risk for injury. So I just want you to kind of keep that in your mind. And as I go through the process, I'm going to talk about different things that we can do. But I want you to always remember, when it comes to strength and conditioning, more is not better. More is just more. So what we want to do is figure out exactly the right balance. And I'm going to teach you some of the things on ways to track that and pay attention to that. U16s, take a look at all the things we want to do in strength and conditioning. Optimal mechanics, performance force, performance power. Those things sound pretty cool, right? Those are the things you want. You want your athletes to have performance power, right? What is performance power? It's your ability to maintain your speed and explosiveness throughout the whole game, not just in the first segments, but also in the last segments, right? So that's how we can kind of track that. We say, hey, this person's got a vertical jump of this. Are they still maintaining their ability to perform that vertical jump at the end of the game, okay? Reactive force. Reactive force is your ability to move your body in the fastest movements possible, depending on what it is that the skill is asking for. And it's your ability to do that over the full length of the game. Optimal mechanics. That's oftentimes what you're trying to reinforce over and over. How to shoot, how to move, how to make movement adjustments. These are things that we're going to get to and are part of what I'm going to talk about, but that's not our emphasis in any way. So the only thing that I want you to pay attention to as I talk is your number one job when working either with the strength coach or doing it yourself is to make sure that the outcome, most specifically, is injury-free. This is a real issue, and we see it more and more now because people are doing too much and there's inadequate development. One of the things you're going to find, if we don't take care of your body and make it so it functions optimally, when we actually put it in sports, particularly in high-velocity sports where there's levels of fatigue, the risk for injury occurs. I was listening to one of the coaches last night talk about he's missing 4 important players due to injury. A player is useless if they have to sit on the bench, right? Can they contribute in the game if they're injured and can't play? So then what's the most important thing we can do? We want to keep them healthy enough, physically able enough that they can exert their athletic will in every game, right? If you've got your best athletes, don't you want them to play every single time? Don't you want them to be able to play for the longer periods of time as necessary? But also, if you've got all your athletes, then you don't need each one to play long minutes as much because you can balance out your team. But what happens is when we start to get injuries, that's going to affect our win outcomes. But even more, if an athlete gets injured, what's their likelihood of getting re-injured? Is it high or low? It's extremely high. The greatest prediction of injury is previous injury. So if you can prevent them from having any injuries, which may or may not be plausible because things happen, it's a contact sport, right? Then that gives us a greater ability to maintain the longevity of that athlete, which is key. And you see the older athletes, what do they do with their minutes and what do they do particularly around practice and those types of things? They don't want to do the practices anymore. They're trying to spare their bodies, particularly if they're making money over it. Okay, because they get it, they understand. Ankle rolls. Is that something that happens in basketball? At an annoyingly high level. What many coaches don't understand is if you roll your ankle one time, you cause an actual level of destruction in your mechanoreceptors. These are communication pathways that make your body run. So if we're not then addressing that particular injury-specific problem, the likelihood of another ankle roll is 2 times that. And then if they roll their ankle twice, it's going to become a chronic condition unless we fix it. In part of the segments tomorrow in the injury prevention stuff, all of the exercises I'm going to show you are specific to basketball-related injury prevention, okay? So a lot of times people say, oh, well, that doesn't really build muscle, that doesn't really build strength. But would you take an athlete that never rolls their ankle over someone who can bench press a high amount of weight? You see what I'm saying? And then developmental readiness. The way I look at it is we've got segments of age groups. And by the time they reach one level, I want them to be at the best that they can be at that level so they can switch to what? The next level. How many times do we have to push a kid to the next level even though developmentally they're not ready? Because you didn't have enough time to work with them developmentally, but their age indicates they have to move on, right? And so these are some other considerations. Are you doing your due diligence to make sure that when they're at 16, they're at the peak of 16. When they're at 17, they're at the peak of 17. When they're at 18, they're ready to move to the next level. One of the criticisms I have, I just wrote a recent textbook, and I'm going to get some flack for it, because I make fun of the people who are doing the coaching that use antiquated models. And here's an example of how I want you to think about it. American football is very, very, very popular. A lot of strength and conditioning stems from American football, and it kind of has lent itself into basketball, which bothers me because their sports aren't comparable. But what I see is this. When I worked with the 18 to 22-year-olds, they would come in at 18, and they would do the same workout that the seniors are doing, which is the 22-year-olds. But wait a second, the 22-year-olds are also doing the same workout as an 18-year-old. Does that make any sense to anybody here? Someone who just came from the high school level, okay? So, your U17 level, your U18 level, and now all of a sudden they're moved up to a whole nother developmental level to start off. There's no. So what I need you to think about is where should this person be at this time and where do they need to be? How can I get them ready to be here? Because they're here. One of the most common errors is just what I said. They take the model of the highest level and they try to adapt it to people who are younger than them. It does not work. Don't do it. You take the model of the young and develop them in each of the stages, and they'll be superior when they get to the next level. Does everyone understand what I'm saying? Starts here. Skeletal function. This is crazy to me, but we see skeletal dysfunction in kids as early as 14 years of age. How is it possible? We didn't have a problem with that when I played sports. Why do you think it's a problem today? I know you're all going to get the right answer. You ever watch kids? One of the big problems is the total amount of movement, and actually Michael gave it per hour of thousands of hours that the average age is not moving. So if you're not moving, you're not really developing physically, right? But also if you're not moving, you have tendencies to be in postural positions and different things like that. So our muscles get out of balance. And that's going to be a significant problem because it increases your risk for injury dramatically. I'll show you this stuff tomorrow. Strength balance is a key component. Do you ever see any of your players where their head's forward and their shoulders around? I can predict the injuries from that within 3 years. Isn't that crazy? I can just look at your posture and predict the injuries from it because I know that just by having your shoulders forward, every time you go up for a rebound, every time you put your arms up, you're just causing your tendon to rub, and it's going to cause an inflammation. And then all of a sudden they get impingement syndrome in the shoulder. How many of the younger players have you ever heard had low back pain? How do young people get low back pain? Well, if your posture changes and my pelvis starts to migrate backwards and my shoulders migrate forward, now I've got, instead of a military-like look, which is what a 14, 15, 16-year-old should maintain, I've got a geriatric look. This happens because some muscles get strong, and if some muscles are strong, what usually happens to the other muscles? They get weak. So that's what muscle balance has to do. When I talk about strength balance, that's what I'm talking about. I don't care how strong you are. One of the things you'll hear me say is strong enough. I have some of the strength coaches in the United States, they have their basketball players squatting 400 pounds. I said, why do they need to squat 400 pounds? On the basketball court, do they ever have to pick up a fat person? You need to be strong enough that you can jump as high as you can jump. You need to be strong enough that you can run as fast as you can run. You need to be strong enough that you can move as quickly and with agility as possible, right? That's strong enough. So a lot of times the common error is, I think it's just the term strength coach. People have this application to just keep making them stronger. It's not the total amount of strength that they have, it's their ability to use it. Strength balance is the key. The second thing that predicts performance besides strength balance is strength to weight ratio. So can those athletes do pull-ups would be a better assessment. Motor activation proficiency. It sounds very fancy, but here's what happens. Do you ever see a person grab the ball and come down, their knees come in? You see that, right? That's awful. Because does this look like I have proper alignment? How many of your athletes have ever had knee problems? Patellotendinitis, suprapatellotendenopathy. I could go on the big long words, but knee pain, right? How many of you have had it? Because I know you all play basketball. Playing basketball and avoiding knee pain is very, very important because the biomechanics that you deal with, I don't have to worry about it because my femur is this long. You have athletes that have femurs that are this long. So your risk for injury there is going to be elevated. If your glutes don't fire properly because they don't have proper activation, when you land, instead of the energy going here where it's supposed to, it goes here and you get compensation. Now, does your knee go diagonal? That's called an ACL tear. Don't let your knee go diagonal or rotational. Freedom of movement. Another common thing that we see, particularly developmentally at this age, is they lose flexibility. I'm going to show you the flexibility assessment, and I'll show you some pictures today, but we'll do it tomorrow. If I took most of this room just in hamstring range of motion, most of you would fail. And if your hamstrings don't function properly, then it attaches to your pelvis. Your pelvis attaches to your back. People say, how come my back hurts? Well, because you have flexibility issues. We see this at 14 years of age now. We didn't used to see it, but now we do. Part of the reason is what you're doing right now. It's terrible for you. What are you doing? You're sitting, right? And you sit, and many of you have round backs because you're tired, because you have to sit here for a couple hours, and your knees are bent too, right? So if your knees are bent, you're also shortening your hamstrings, and many of you are going to have tight hip flexors. I'll show you that tomorrow. Well, if I can't lengthen this, and I can't lengthen this, I can't get this to work properly. So then what has to do all the work? This is called a kinetic chain. See this guy? If anything gets out of whack, the proficiency of movement. Think about it from this perspective. If I took your car and I bent the axle of the car, would that car drive very well? With a bent axle? It wouldn't drive very well. But let's say I wanted the car to go faster. Should I work on the motor to make it go faster? Or should I fix the axle? That's what I'm talking about. You have to have the framework functioning properly before I can speed things up, okay? Too many times what coaches will do is there's problems along that kinetic chain, and they'll work on the motor but not fix the problem. I'm going to show you guys how to fix the problems. It's not overly complicated. It's just something that you have to take time to do. And force adequacy is, are they strong enough to do what you want them to do for the whole game? That's how strong they have to be. Stronger doesn't mean better. Strength, balance, and power, because power equals speed, is better, right? Don't you want fast players? You want fast players with proficiency in movement? Do you want explosive players? Those are the words that you want to hear, right? Because anybody can be strong. Does strong mean that you're an athlete? There's a lot of strong people who are terrible athletes, but they're strong. So make sure when you think about what it is that you're trying to accomplish that you put your efforts in the right area. Here's another thing I'm going to introduce to you tomorrow. When you guys have traditionally done exercises or conditioning work, it normally goes this way: forward, backwards, or sometimes what? Sideways. But between forward and sideways, I have another vector. Right? One on one side, one on the other. Between backwards and sideways, I have another vector. Basketball is played in vectors. It's not played. How many of your plays are? Doesn't work like that. There's pivots, there's moving, there's ballistic activity. These areas are another place that we're going to have to focus on. So a lot of the traditional movements, we're going to modify them for basketball because basketball is not bodybuilding. Basketball will utilize conditioning components that reflect the game. So again, what's my focus? Well, the first thing I talked about was my focus was injury-free. Now my focus is going to be more specific to the game's activities or the specific movements that we engage in, because we want to replicate them in whole or in part so that they're better at it. Now, one of the common things that we're going to see are changes in your body posture. And when we see changes in your body posture, I know it's going to disrupt your movement speed. So the ones I'm going to talk about and show you how to fix tomorrow, I wanted you to be able to get a skeletal look at today. The upper body dysfunctions are generally most associated with the forward shoulders. Now watch my back. Do you see that problem? Everybody stand up. Now what I want you to do is this. Put yourself in a military position, and I want you to take both your arms, raise them in front of you, and reach as high to the ceiling as possible. Go ahead. Reach up. Thumbs face backwards. Now reach up and back as far as possible. You see how far you can get? It's actually not bad, but you got to keep your arms straight. If your arms are bent, that already tells me you're tight. Ouch, right? All right, relax. Now, I'm going to change your posture to reflect people that have a level of dysfunction. What I want you to do is this. Just take your shoulders and let them just round a little bit forward, and take your chest and just drop it a little bit. Now hold that position and try and put your arms up over your head. Oh, that's ugly. Go ahead and sit down. It is going to be tough to make rebounds when your arms go here. So then what happens? To get their arms up, they have to what? They change their movements, and they change it at high speed. And that's why it precipitates problems. Did I change your muscles in any way between those two activities? All we did was change where your bones were, right? Because if your muscles wind up becoming too tight in certain areas and too weak in other areas, there's no compensation. So in this case, what happens, which I'll show you tomorrow, is people get tightness here, and that pulls you this way, right? Because which way does gravity pull? It always wants to pull you forward, right? So when we're sitting in chairs, when we're standing, when we're tired and talking when the coach is talking, we go into these relaxation postures where our body can hold itself up. The problem is over time, we start to weaken muscles and tighten muscles. The muscles in the back get weak, and the muscles in the front get shorter and tighter. So there's a propensity there. Now, it gets worse, because if I start to reflectively move forward, this area right here, where your scapula is, that's the function of your shoulder. So if your scapula starts to move outwards and upwards, my shoulder function can't work. So now when you're doing pass drills, I'm reducing the amount of force that I can produce through my forward applications, but I'm also increasing the impingement or friction in your shoulders, which then leads to people that have shoulder pain. And when you start to get discomfort in your shoulders, you start to adjust your gait again, don't you? You start running slightly differently, and that changes the mechanics down in your trunk. So what we wind up seeing is initial problems here, and then we wind up seeing problems here, which is weird because you say, hey, the issue's really here because of poor posturing and a lack of strength balance. The other problem is this. A lot of particularly the younger athletes, like to do the bench press because it makes them feel like they have a level of strength by lifting that weight and that application heavy. But in any sports, I say, when do you replicate a bench press? When do you find yourself on the ground having to pick something very heavy up off you? Does that happen in basketball very often? But in basketball, we do have applications of throwing, right? We have to have forward force. So I have to have equal and opposite compensation. When we play other sports like tennis, where there is a racket component, there's a rotational component, we have different muscular considerations. But in basketball, there's a lot of forward and directional throws that we have to compensate for in our back musculature. I'm going to show you how to do that during your training, even if you don't use weights, okay? Pushing, pulling, reaching, passing, and rotation are all affected by those things. If any of those things are important to you and your players, then I'd suggest you pay attention to how to fix those issues. The second one is where we get lower body, and some of you have seen this. Do you ever see this posture? Particularly ones where they have an angle, where their hip, where you can see an arching in their back. If you see that, that precipitates to other problems because it usually is going to cause impingement syndromes in their discs. That leads to compensation, which leads to low back pain. So, whenever I have athletes that have low back pain, one of the first things we do is look at the front. Because if these muscles get too tight, which is very, very common in this age group because they sit a lot. If you look at the amount of time spent sitting from when you were much younger to the kids that are reflective of the 14 and 15-year-olds today, the amount of time sitting is considerably higher, which means they're flexed hips for a longer period of time, which means the tendency for that to shorten. And you get a problem because the muscles here are what are supposed to stabilize you during action. So when you jump and shoot, when you have mobility action, when you're trying to change direction, the reactive stiffening that occurs, you guys have heard the term core, right? Have you heard that term before, core musculature? It's the muscles inside, not your abs. That's an external muscle, but the muscles on the inside that can stabilize. So if I've got forces going this way, I'm strong enough to stop those forces and go the other way faster than the other person. That's how juke moves work. That's how the person has an ability to make a crossover or a cut move that makes the other person fall down like you saw in the video earlier today. If we lose function here, your pelvis changes position, and then I lose function here, and now the speed of my change of direction is compromised. Doesn't sound like weightlifting, does it? It sounds like getting your muscles in balance, okay? This problem here, if you guys are experiencing back pain, trunk stability, inhibition, which is the problem I just talked about, rotational torque on the femur, and when I have rotational torque on the femur, that affects what? Your knee, right? Should your knee rotate? And then I have forward-backwards vectors. So the vectors that move here and the vectors that move here are going to have a level of compromise because I changed my pelvic position. Look. Versus having a freedom of movement. Okay? When we look at the body, a lot of times we always look at it from the front. Well, we also need to look at it from the lateral aspects too. And the lateral aspects, what happens is we have muscles that connect here. See, it's kind of set up like a circus tent. Well, if those muscles start to get out of balance, the pelvis will start to tilt like this. It's not noticeable unless you have a trained eye. And so one of the first things that we'll do with the athletes is we have them perform squatting movements. And those overhead squatting movements, if I see, and I'll show you this in a little bit, but if I see their body collapsing forward when they go to squat, this is too tight. If I see them squatting and I see this, do you see my knees? Because I have a lateral distortion. I'm translating my hips, so when they actually go and plant, they'll do this. Now I have an uneven distribution of force, so one, it's inefficient, but two, I increase my risk for injury. These imbalances, if you talk to any of the more proficient physiotherapists or physical therapists or orthopedic surgeons, they'll tell you these are the things that are causing the problems. Very rarely is it a single action that causes it. It's the repetitiveness and then eventually something happens, okay? The contact in basketball only complicates things because it makes you get distorted upon landing, or you might have to throw a ball from an awkward position, or a ball going out of bounds you might have to lunge for in some particular situation, which then you think, oh, that person got hurt because they made an effort play. But there's other people that make effort play that don't get hurt. Okay, so what happens is during the highest speed actions, oftentimes we have issues. When we have people that have postural distortions here, you can see what happens to the knee angle, and that's a real issue. Spinal function, so if this tilts, it puts uneven pressure here. There's your back pain again. Locomotion or gait, it reduces your speed. I can't have that because speed kills. If I can get by a person, now I don't have a defender to deal with. And force activation patterns. When they go to jump off one foot to do a layup, they won't get as high. So now that ball got blocked, or they weren't fast enough off that foot, so now they weren't able to make the play. All you're doing with this concept is allowing the athlete to be the best athlete that they can be. Okay? When we talk about over 18s, now we're talking next level. All right? But this will allow them to develop the skills that you guys teach. And that's what you need. Because if I get a 17, 18-year-old who's already been playing since they were 13, I had better have the developmental readiness at that stage, because I can't have a skill set of a 14-year-old when they're playing in the U18. So it's not helpful at all. Another thing I want you to take a look at, particularly when they shoot, is flattening feet. You ever see people's knees come a little bit closer together because it looks like something's wrong with their ankles? You particularly see this in basketball. It's more of a concern because there's so much action directed off the foot in multi-directional purposes and upward that if we don't have proper foot position, I have an increased risk for injury. So some of the athletes that have high arches, they've got a greater risk of injury for ankle rolls, right? So if I know you have high arches and you've got a greater injury for ankle rolls, what should I work on? The muscles that prevent that, correct? I also have the foot flattening problem. One of the things that we do is we'll put down the brown crepe paper and we have them step in water. And then we just have them walk. And then we look at what their footprint looks like. If their footprint looks like this, it's going to be a high arch situation. If I see a normal footprint, something that you might see in a picture of a sand aspects, you'll find that that's a normal footprint. But if that thing's flat and looks like a glob, it's because the whole foot flattens out. When the whole foot flattens out, that means your knee goes in. And when your knee goes in, I'm increasing the susceptibility of those problems. It's particularly more of a problem for females because they also have wider hips, don't they? So if you have wider hips, then your Q angle changes. So females have a greater susceptibility to ACL and related knee injuries than males do just because of these problems. Okay, so those of you working with female athletes, this is a major consideration. Look at their feet, look at their ankles, and look at their hips. If those things are out of whack, they're going to have problems. All of which is fixable. Sometimes what we'll do is we need orthotics. In other cases, we have to fix the problems. The person's glutes aren't firing properly, so their knees have a tendency to come in, so now they're flat-footed. That's not because of their feet, that's because of their what? It's because of their glutes, okay? You've heard of these before. Ankle rolls, knee tracking issues, particularly suprapatellar plantar fasciitis. Anyone here ever had plantar fasciitis? Pains in the bottom of your feet? No one here has ever had that? It's amazing. And IT band syndrome, do you know what that is? That's the pain here. IT band syndrome happens very commonly amongst this age group because they don't do anything. And then they come into your camp and you do a lot. 0 to a lot is too much. The body can't take it. So here's another thing to consider. When you start working with them, where are they to start? A lot of coaches are frustrated. Oh, they're out of shape. Let's run them. Do you know what the worst thing you could do? Is that. Because they're so out of shape, you putting this much intensity upon them, their bodies can't compensate for it. Michael and I were talking about what's called the supercompensation model. Everything needs to be in balance. So sometimes we want to work the heck out of them, but before we work the heck out of them, what do? We make sure they're ready. Okay? I use the term strong enough. Are they in shape enough to train harder? Are they fit enough to push to the next level? You can't take someone who's out of shape. Now, young people are resilient, I'll tell you, so you may have done it before, but I'm suggesting not. Don't take someone who's out of shape and try to train them like someone who's in shape. You say, yeah, maybe they throw up, but they're getting integrity. I don't care if they throw up. Push them. The problem is what's going on here. And if this becomes overtrained, now you guys have a player that may get injured during your season, and that's not helping you. They're willing to work hard, though. I love that. I can't stand lazy. I'm more of a negative feedback when I'm in group sessions, and then I'm positive feedback on individual sessions. but I can't stand lazy. Effort gives points, but the problem is effort doesn't always overcome the deficiencies. Okay, so you got to take that effort and you got to put it in the right places. Sometimes we have to slow things down before we can speed them up, and that's one of the hardest things for coaches. Because what you guys want is more time. What you guys want is to have them here now. I need them here so that we have a better chance to win. So again, let's go back, because this is frustrating, particularly in these age groups, but you have to have your focal points. If you have 15 focus points, you've already lost the point. That's way too many, okay? And then be detail-oriented. Do everything perfect. People say, how do you get your athletes to move so proficiently? And I say, I only let them move correctly. And people are astounded by that. Well, if they do it wrong, they do it again until they can do it right. I only accept right. But a lot of times what happens is we got to do something else. Well, I want to get to the next drill. I want to do the next thing. And so I get satisfactory. Is that what you want from your team? Satisfactory performance? So a lot of times if we just kind of shrink things up and put a little bit more focus in, you guys will find a lot more improvements in the outcomes. Now, this word core stabilization, you'll hear me use it. It's a very popular buzzword within the conditioning industry. But what it really means is this. Everything starts here because you have to come off the ground, right? That's the only point of contact that we have in basketball is the ground. So everything has to come off there. But the implement that we have to get into the hole is here. So all the energy has to transfer from what? There to here. I have to have absolute control. Where does all that energy have to cross? And one of the problems is we lose energy, often referred to as energy leakage. We lose energy at joints. Where are the most joints? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up your trunk. All right, so the integrity of your middle is very, very important. So again, when I talk about strength, ground to hand strength, hand to ground strength. I need it to be able to go up and down with proficiency. The problem that we see in most athletes is they're strong in certain areas, but then they have weakness in other areas. I have some athletes who, when I put them on the leg press, they do hundreds and hundreds of pounds. I put them on the bench press, they do hundreds of pounds. That's not helpful. Because if I can't transfer your leg strength to your upper body strength, I just lost the whole point. If I can't take my upper body strength and transfer it to my leg strength, I lost the whole point. So the key area that connects you is your middle. I'm going to show you tomorrow some drills that you can do. They're called towel drills. That makes it inexpensive. It's something that anybody can do. You just put 2 towels on the ground and we start doing trunk drills. Most people are used to doing drills where they lay on their back and they do exercises, right? You guys have seen sit-ups, crunches, all those things? Stop wasting your time. That's for bodybuilders. They want pretty abs. I need someone who can take a ball and throw it over there as fast as possible. I don't need to have pretty abs. Total different thought process. Basketball is played standing. Why would you lay down? So what that's called is functional density. The function of the sport needs to be replicated in your training. All your peripheral delivery, when I use the term peripheral, that just means your arms or legs, okay? This is what, when I say central, it just means the middle. These are the things that have the ability to have greatest range. This is what we call reactive strength. I have to have applications of strength that allow me to transfer force across my base of support. And you guys know basketball comes off 1 foot more often than it comes off 2, right? Say yes. Which means I also have to have unilateral as well as bilateral capabilities. And guess which plane often dictates that? Unilateral versus bilateral, which one do you think is more important in the function of it? Going forward and backwards or going side to side? Side to side stabilizes forward and backwards. So if I stand on 1 foot, my balance comes from these muscles. So if I never teach people how to move in those movement patterns or develop those muscles equally to forward and backwards, my forward and backwards isn't as good. It's not as fast, and my femoral angle is different. When this angle is different, my jump is lower or higher, depending on how proficient you are. My running speed is different. The other thing I need you to understand, when we look at the trunk, power attributes all come from rotation. So if we look at sprinters, they come out of the blocks and the first thing they do is rotate their trunk to optimize power. When they throw the basketball, does everyone throw a basketball like this? Because if you do, I will make fun of you. There's always rotational components, right? One, we've got defensive strategies to keep the ball away from other people, but also from a rotational component, you can develop greater force and speed. Now, sometimes we have to have forward passes, but oftentimes that's even done in staggered stances. It's not a perfect bilateral situation. So we want to replicate that in our exercises. And this is what I was just alluding to. Traditional stability comes from cross stabilization. So what happens is, here's my base of support, here's my 2 feet, I've got forces going this way and then directional going this way. You can see you have to push this way to go the opposite direction, correct? But if I don't have equal and opposite forces, I'm going to fall down. So balance is the sum of forces equaling 0. But dynamic applications is controlled chaos. I don't have to always have 0. I just have to not have so much that I'm going to fall down. The highest speeds are done with a level of lack of control because that's how locomotion works. So if you want to move faster, you have to be more stable. For instance, when people walk, they walk based on the stability of their trunk and obviously the length of their legs. So when I step, I'm falling, but I catch myself, right? Old people, so a younger person will walk to where they're falling. I step out far enough and I fall. I step out far enough and I fall, and that allows me to move forward. You ever see old people? Why? Because they don't have any stability, so they try to keep their base of support over their feet, so they don't take long stride lengths. If I can increase the stability controls here, here, and here, that allows me to take longer stride lengths, which allows me to move faster. And I can move faster this way, this vector, or forward. Running speed, back stepping, and vector stepping is all faster. Not because of your legs, but because you're what? The stable platform. That's why it's getting so much attention in strength and conditioning over the last several years, because they realize, wait, everything stems from balance. Can't apply force to something that doesn't apply force back. Otherwise, you get no measured force. Unilateral force, because you got to come off one foot, and then we also have bilateral cross forces. Sometimes we do jump off 2 feet, but in most cases, we're going to move off 2 stable positions, but they're not balanced in the way that the forces are, right? We step a certain direction and we rotate, and we're also trying to use counter-rotational forces so I can change direction very rapidly. All comes from your middle. This goes to when I say train the trunk off the ground. I'm going to show you guys some of the trunk-based exercises tomorrow where it's more of a standing. There are a couple on-the-ground exercises that you can do as well, but it has to be a balance in movements, and I need to see how it's either a standard process by I'm just looking for developing absolute strength in the muscle, or it is a basketball-related or basketball-specific functional drill, okay? I'm going to give you stuff you can immediately take home with. I put these down because these are the things, all the stuff I'm talking about today, I'm going to show you tomorrow. As you can tell, to be detail-oriented, you have to reinforce everything. We do it over and over and over again. That's why I say kind of focus on a couple of smaller things. Because of our lack of time, I'm giving you a little bit more than I'm actually totally comfortable with, but I also have resources you can have afterwards to go back and look at the stuff. Overhead squat assessment. Basically, you're going to have them put their hands up over their head and they're going to squat. We're going to look at what happens. It gives us a lot of information, and I'll show you that tomorrow. Actually, when I did this with the U16s, last time I had an athlete that was being used as my sample for demonstration purposes, and he went into the overhead squat position, went down, and couldn't get back up. 16 years old. Arms up over his head, he squats, his knees cave in, and he can't. I have to lift him back up. How's that muscle balance? He's one of the players, and that's what you're working with. I almost fell over. I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed for him, not for me. Overhead lunge test. This is your ability to look at medial lateral sway. Does the athlete take short step because they don't have the ability to lengthen? Do they have compensatory actions to where the knees come in any direction? We're looking at things that doesn't look right. Wait, that doesn't look right. You guys know when you're watching your athletes and they are performing drills, you know when they have the basketball, wait, that doesn't look right. What did they do wrong? And that's what you're going to be able to utilize. These tests are just going to look at your hamstrings and low back, your hip flexors, the lateral lunge with rotation. This looks at your ability to move in these vectors. All right? Probably tests that you may have seen in the past if you've had an injury and they tested you. But in most cases, you probably haven't seen these examples before. But that's why you come to these educational programs, so that you can learn the newest stuff. The other one is the lateral overhead test, and this looks at stability in the lateral planes. I just put this up because I'm not going to leave you hanging. If I show you something, I'm going to give you the examples to take with you. So you'll have these charts to see what each thing tells you. And if we have low scores, the prediction of injury is high. We have, has anyone here heard of a functional movement screen? You've heard of the functional movement screen? Now, the validity of the functional movement screen, still there's not enough research out. But it's been used widely in multiple sports, including at the pro level in American football. It's been studied to a level of degree. Basketball has gained a significant amount of popularity in the functional movement screen. And what it basically does is this. You get scored. And if your numbers are very, very low, the prediction of injury is very, very high. So if you're failing your tests and we add up, hey, you did 5 tests. And we add that up, and all of a sudden you have a level of 5, which I'm telling you is not that uncommon, even amongst what you would call your skilled players. Because that means they're skilled in maybe shooting or they're skilled in some application, but they're not going to be able to exert their athletic will very long because they're going to be injury-ridden. And you can name the names of athletes that you know have had shortened careers, or their careers weren't as good because they were always what? They're always injured. That's unacceptable. You will be able to control those components. So these will give you the answers, and I also will have a reference form for you that will also explain when you do the test, what to look for most specifically, so you don't have to memorize all this, okay? That's a lot. Now, one of the things that we're going to take a look at is making it systematic. And this is how we take our developmental process, put it into specific focus, and be detail-oriented. Level 1, can they move? If they can't put their arms up over their head, I should probably fix that. If they can't extend their pelvis, I need to fix that. So we have to make them just function like a 14, 15, 16-year-old should be able to function. They should not have any dysfunctional components or limitations. I had a word up there called movement restriction. And I always ask my students the same question. I say, if you got a person who I need to move fast, but they're pulling an anchor, what's the best way to make them move faster? Should I make them really strong? Should I make them more powerful? Or should I just remove the anchor? It's a pretty simple question, right? So I don't understand why these people have anchors, and yet everyone's working them out with all these muscles, but they're still pulling the anchor. I don't want you to be better at pulling the anchor. I don't want any anchors. If I get rid of the anchors, now I have free will and movement. So what we look here is get rid of any of the anchors. And then we do the core training. If you just get to this level for your athletes, if they are what we would call functionally healthy, they're already going to be as good a basketball player as you can then make them, because they won't be injured. Now, next level, coordinated strength, controlled shifts, and stability endurance. That means that they can perform perfectly throughout each game through the full duration of the game time. Okay, first and second half, I don't see much decrease in their performance outcomes. Also, that's when we get them ready for the next level. Now remember, we're still talking about the younger kids here, but if I'm not getting you ready to move to the next level, then I'm not doing my number 1. Because I can make someone really good as a young basketball player from a win-loss, but that doesn't mean that they'll be good as an older basketball player. You understand my point? So, these are going to be the exercises I'm going to show you tomorrow. We're going to look at the problems where hip flexors and your low back are the issue. We're going to look at the problems where your hips have a lateral translation or deviation. We're going to look at the problems where your shoulders come forward. And we're going to look at the problems of the knee and the ankle. So if I tell you, I can give your athletes healthy ankles, healthy knees, healthy shoulders and back, healthy hips, you'd be pretty happy with me, wouldn't you? What else are you going to do? Now, if they get hit by a bus, I can't help. But I can help with their functional balance, okay? Because they're dealing with the same stuff all the time. And it's pretty simple. I got gravity, so let's account for gravity. I've got ground forces, which is called ground reaction force. That's where you can take this energy and transfer it somewhere. And then I've got momentum, which is multi-directional force. My ability to increase this is based on my ability to use this. And then I always have to deal with this, right? So if I can put those three things together by making a strong middle and having that transfer into the peripheral segments, you won. Then it's on you. I can't help you past that. That's your coaching skills now and their athletic capability. The one thing that's difficult or somewhat frustrating for coaches is the innate aspect of athleticism. Because you can make someone stronger, right? You can make someone run faster. You can make someone more technically sound in the skills. But can you make an athlete? Athletes are born. You can make an athlete better. So what I always say is let's start with the best foundations and then you guys can do the rest. But if you're not establishing the foundations, it's going to be a limitation. So one of the things I also want to talk about, everyone always likes the word acceleration. This is where injuries usually hurt, in deceleration. Landing, some sort of application of stepping, those different types of things. People don't get hurt when they first go up. They get hurt when they come down. They don't get hurt when they lunge forward. They get hurt when they stop themselves from moving forward. So we'll take a look at the balance forward and backwards. Now, each of these things is going to have application because I always need you to take it back to functional density. I need it to go back to basketball. So they bend, they squat, they step, they lunge, right? They push, pull, reach, and pass, right? They pivot, hop, bound, and leap, all these different things. So then all of this stuff has an integrated component to those aspects. So your tibia and your femur is simply there to there. So that's where we'll have the lowest portion of application. Your pelvis is your middle and your spine, and then your thoracic spine, scapula, and glenohumeral joint. So we're going to do a ground up application because always start on the ground. If someone has upper body issues in the top, it usually stems from the kinetic chain, which always contacts the ground, okay? So we're always going to fix your lower parts, then your middle parts, then your upper parts, and everything just fixes itself along the chain. That speeds up the process. Now, sometimes we might just have a localized problem. I'll show you how to deal with that tomorrow. So when we create foundations, the first thing we want to do is master movement. See this? We have to do that before we do that. Because what goes up must also what? Come down. So when we work with the younger kids, we actually work on applications of landing. Then, when we actually do jumping, we don't do jumping and landing because that's how many? 1, 2. That's too many. I'll jump but take the landing out. So you guys have seen box jumps before, right? Where the person jumps up on the box. They jump up on the box, but then they step down. They jump up on the box, but then they step down. Prior to learning box jumps, because when you jump up on a box and you land on the box, your weight is stopped. I don't have to deal with the weight going up and times the acceleration of the weight coming down. I'll work first on landing, then I'll work on jumping. So when we talk about developmental components, we take and break it down. Lunge positions can have very diverse range of motion. So I'm going to do sports lunges before I do weightlifting lunges. How often do you really find yourself in this position? It's not a common position in basketball, is it? A full lunge? But we often do walking lunges. So I'm going to show you some modifications to each of these things. Once they get good at movement, then we can start to make the application different. This is where we use sandbags. This is where we use just different instruments, medicine balls, and those types of things to make it much more skill specific and related to the sport. Then we challenge it. And then we speed it up. Okay? So developmental component is you master the skill, you load the skill, you challenge it, and then you speed it up. But what happens is most people skip everything and they go here. But they don't do this. This is the most important. This transfers across a lifetime. This will just, whatever the body needs to get it done, it will do. But does that mean it does it right? And doing it wrong over a long period of time generally leads to the issues. That's the problem. Because if I let them bypass the developmental process, they'll learn it wrong. It's called movement compensation. They'll do it wrong. But they get really good at what? Doing it wrong. And do you know how hard it is to teach someone who's been doing it? How many of you have had to coach kids who another coach taught them something wrong? And their tendency now is to always, right? I see that head. Yep. Damn coach. Because it's much harder to teach someone who already knows something else compared to having a blank slate, which you can just do whatever it is that you want, okay? Now, when we look at these things, step, lunges, balance, movement, range of motion, movement and balance, this is developmental processes. And here's the other thing I need you to remember. Remember all these directions? It drives me crazy that coaches make people go forward and they make them go sideways, but they forget all the positions of sports. So we're going to take these actions and we're going to build upon them. But do you see the development? First learn movement, then learn balance in movement, then make movement with greater range of motion, because that's basically taking the movement with the balance components. Then we get an application of dynamic balance. Now I can do all my shuffling and add loads to it. And these will be training mechanisms that you may or may not use depending on what your team is like. One of the things I'll show you tomorrow are the matrices that are evolved around these different components. So how do I step properly? Stepping forward and backwards is pretty simple, right? But the first thing I always say is watch your kids walk. If I see a kid that walks like this, see my feet? You ever see the kids that have their feet outwardly rotated? Maybe some of you. If your feet outwardly rotate, that means these muscles aren't working properly and these are overworking. So when they go to push off, when they do those things, it will not be an application that's directed appropriately through your knee. Your knee's complicated, but it's simple. It's simple because all it is a tendon that connects to a bone that just runs perfectly linear into the femur. The problem is, what do we do with our knee? We have all different positions. So if I'm already starting this way, but I need to go forward, what's the problem? That kid is going to have difficulties with stepping because of an outwardly rotated hip. The problem isn't their knee. The problem is what? It's here. These muscles are too tight. So we want to take a look at these things. You want to watch people move and say, wait a second, what was that? And why did that happen? Because then you can rectify the problem. So what we're going to start to take a look at are movements that you can do on the court. Because one of my purposes here, I don't need you to be strength coaches. I need you to be awesome basketball coaches. But one of the things that the strength coaches deal with is sports coaches that don't understand. Or, depending on where you go in life, you may be hiring a strength and conditioning coach to work with your teams. And you guys know that many in the private sector, many of your players may have their own trainer, which may be excellent or may be terrible. But what I need you to do is know whether they're excellent or terrible. Okay, I don't need you to be that particular person, but I need you to understand. But one of the reasons that I want to show you this stuff is many of these actions we can do on the court. So if you don't have the opportunity, particularly with the younger players, you don't have that time, the resources and stuff, but we may want to work on musculoskeletal balances, we can do these exercises on the court as part of our planned programs, okay? Does it have to be done every day? Say no. Does it have to be done 4 times a week? Say no. But there has to be some sort of aspects related to it. And generally, if it's done less than 2 times a week, what's the ability of it to be retained? It's reduced rather dramatically. Okay, so just like the skills that you're also going to utilize, you pick the things that are most important for your particular players. And I always say this to coaches. They're here. I have to hear, what can I do with them now? Right? Because I may need more time to fix a lot of these other problems, but what can I do with them now to win is another consideration. And that goes right back to our first point. What's my focus going to be in that period? See this? This is one of the drills. These are weighted basketballs that we'll use. So in this case, she starts on one side, she does a lunge position, and then she gets back into a shooting position. That's called functional density. That means that I took the lunge, I took the rotational component, I put them together and went into a sports skill. So when I was talking about functional density, this doesn't look like what you see in the weight room, does it? But this is what we can see on the basketball court, and we can use different resistance loads to accommodate it. Okay, so along with the injury prevention stuff, I'm going to show you some of this stuff tomorrow too. Now, when I get into areas of development, you guys are going to be able to probably deal with this. This is what a lot of people are surprised to see. Ballistics and plyometrics. You know the jumps, explosive movements? Kids in this age group, look at how many structured jumps should be in a week's time. That's not very many. So 50 ballistics is where there's some sort of ground contact. So let's say I'm doing some sort of lunge jumps. I'm allowed to do 50 repetitions of that. That's it, 50 repetitions of that type of exercise, and then 50 repetitions of things where we have explosiveness. Because their bodies aren't designed to maintain high levels of impact yet. The musculoskeletal system hasn't strengthened because of the developmental process. And it makes sense as to why. When you're growing vertically, your body does not distribute much energy to mass. The energy has to go to something, right? So when you get these kids and they're going through those growth spurts, they're not designed to take on high levels of force application in the way an 18, 19, 20-year-old is. When we look at bone mass, for instance, bone mass is maximized between 18 and 20 years of age, which means that the kids that you're working with, particularly the U16s, they're in the growth development aspects, so nutrition's a key element, but their susceptibility to not having maximal strength and performance capabilities is limited. So just keep that in mind. Now think about this. If we're going to do these drills for performance-based outcomes, how many times are they jumping a week playing basketball? So as a sports coach, this is very important, particularly if they have another trainer that's working with the team, is for you to monitor how much jumping is going on. Because impact forces are one of the things that lead to overtraining syndrome. And that goes back to this one. What's too much? Coaches are always blown away when I go through the programmatic outcomes and I cut their programs down. And the reason they're blown away is they're like, what are you doing? You're taking away all the good stuff. And then they're most surprised by the athlete performs better. Because again, more is not better. Be very detail-oriented with your specific focus and you'll get the outcome you're looking for. When we talk about ballistic movements, we're going to talk about landing, we're going to talk about bilateral and unilateral upward force, we're going to talk about whether it's symmetrical or asymmetrical. Asymmetrical is basketball. How often do you look perfectly symmetrical in basketball? Movements are always, because you have another competitor component, right? So I'm always trying to get the proper defensive or offensive position, which causes my body to have to move in all directions. Sometimes I have to keep the basketball in a position that it's away from the defender, right? So actually basketball is one of the most unique aspects in cuts might be off a non-pivot point or it may be off a sticking point. So when we see other sports like football, what they'll do is they'll cut and this leg will be straight so that they can turn to run because they can hold the implement here. With basketball, you'll see people dribble and turn. Now look at this knee's not straight, is it? But I'm going to go in that direction. So you actually have two necessary components for strengthening. One is this way and one is in the pivot points. So another consideration, and that's where we're going to determine what it is that we're doing. There's your functional density again. And then this is just the jumps I was talking about. Because we want to plan enough that they get good at it, but not so much that they get overtrained, particularly because they're doing a lot of running and jumping with your other sports. Yeah? It's one of the most difficult questions to answer. There's something called an aging curve. So in the scientific literature, yes, we can do deductions based on some measurements, okay? But you have to have those pre-measurements and post-measurements to look at where they are along the curve. In most cases, what they'll use is height and weight, and that's, that starts from a very, very young age. But I would suggest that you can create your own maturation cycle based on their movement proficiency and changes that you've seen over a period of time, okay? And so it becomes fairly anecdotal. You're monitoring, if you want to go into the science and look at aging curve, you'll look at the metrics, but some of the stuff you'll have to use an exercise scientist or something to get that information, so it's not that helpful, unless you have those resources. To tell you the truth, we have the resources at the university. I mean, it's the stuff we do, but none of the coaches use it because it's another thing for them to think about. And unless it's going to be useful for them, it doesn't make much sense. And at the really this age group, the U16, most of the strength and conditioning and developmental processes, they're not thinking at that level because they don't get paid, which makes sense too, right? If you're getting paid to do something, you're going to put a lot more effort into it compared to some of the voluntary aspects of the lower. Now, I'm going to show you guys some things related to maybe some non-traditional movements, but here are some things that we'll do. Whereas another person might take this 16-year-old girl and tell her she has to jump upwards, what are we doing? She starts up and she lands down. So what we're teaching her is, her body's quite long for her age at this point, right? So the advantage you have with girls, though, is they develop earlier, so their maturation cycle is shortened compared to a male's per se. But the problem is they grow fast. And if you get tall quickly, your muscles aren't strong relative to the physics, when I did the introduction I was talking about. So we're going to teach them how to land. But sometimes landing, that's too easy. So what do? We take landing and make landing more challenging. Okay, the reason I put this slide up here, this is a drill that we commonly use. We've had to go with this with all our female volleyball players at the university. They jump up all the time, right? But the problem is, we did an analysis on them, and these are the 18, 19, 20-year-old women, and they are not strong enough to manage the compensation necessary for their weight landing. So we have to go with these drills even at that level, okay? That underscores the importance of starting developmentally. Can you go into ballistic rebound, step ladder on ballistic bounds? I'm going to show you some of that stuff tomorrow. Yeah, you can. But again, you're going to have to make your determination based on what your confidence is on the athlete's performance. And you guys also know there's always a team personality, right? And that personality might be, hey, this team is very skillful, or this team is very united. Sometimes you get a team that this team's very mature, and that you'll make your decision based on that. Because anything can be adjusted. That's the one thing I also, in my textbook, I criticize strength coaches who work with basketball athletes. I say, wait a second. If you got 12 to 15 people, why do they not have individuality in their exercise programs? Are you that lazy? Now, I understand with football it's a little different. There's 100. American football, we have to deal with 100 athletes, right? So we try to get some individuality, but come on. 25 segments through 4 hours each day, and that's not even practice. That's just weightlifting. So in that case, the resources are not necessarily there. But with basketball, we should be dissecting each athlete and looking at those things. And I know that's what this morning's session and some of the other things are going to be about, is doing profiling on the different athletes. And then just looking at your resources, and then again, putting your focus and detail-oriented work into those. The stuff I'm going to show you tomorrow is some of your athletes. Like I'm going to show you things like T reaches and movements, which causes core stabilization, but also get your back to function properly. Some of your athletes, they're going to stand on one foot and they're going to be able to do T reaches. Others, we're going to have to start in just functionally easier positions. So you can also make adjustments there too. The last couple of slides that I have are related to just the things that most people think of with strength conditioning, which is speed work, change of direction work, and those types of things. At this age group, we're really looking at center of mass control. Where are their hips relative to their movements? Okay, I want to see where their knees and their hips and their shoulders are in alignment. More so than I care about the optimal speed, because you can always cheat your way through. Yes, sir? Do I teach improper alignment? Over here. Now, you have to teach, that was kind of my point from the beginning, is we have to look all the way across the kinetic chain, and you have to take a look at the different applications. So if you have someone who has tendons, and this is what we call them tendencies, because sometimes maybe it's done correctly, but sometimes there's a tendency to precipitate a high risk joint angle. what we do is we need to rehearse proper movement applications, but what we'll also, for an individual like this, it looks like there's instability in his ankle, we'll do drills. And I'm going to show you the ankle stability stuff, which is injury prevention. But then let's say I've got a case where I need strengthening. Have you ever seen the stability devices, the blow-up balls, and those types of things? So with our early drills, we may even use them as warm-ups because I like to use injury prevention during the warm-up because you're going to need to move anyway, right? So I might have them do ankle stability drills where they're doing movement reaches. But if I need strengthening, then I might put them on a stability device and have them stabilize and touch, and work on the strengthening components. It's a very good point. And I do appreciate you pay attention to the detail. Because how many people looked at that and didn't notice? Happens all the time because it's just all kinds of information getting thrown at you. You got some short guy yelling at you, and now you got to pay attention to all this. Kinetic chain connectivity is going to be our next focus, which is what we talked about. That's getting that to get to there so that we can deal with this. Leg strength qualities. This is very important, again, for both athletes, but females is something that we want to pay attention to because of the Q angle. And then asymmetries. Asymmetries, which is rehearsed time to kinematic differences. Kinematic differences means movement. So if I've got a player who can go right all the time, what is their proficiency at going left? A lot of times you'll see someone's really good and we know, hey, you want to know how to defend that player? Just make them go in that direction. They can't compensate in that direction. So what's important to me is that you develop symmetry in your ability. So what we do are change of direction, time change of direction drills. And I'll have you move in one direction and assess your performance. I'll have you move the other direction, assess your performance. A lot of times what we'll do now with the phones is really nice because you can do real-time video, shoot the video and show them their foot position in the change of direction. See how your hips are angled this way? So sometimes we have to slow things down before we speed it up. But I need you to be able to go left just as easy as you go right. And what oftentimes people don't do, and you got to remember during the developmental ages is the best time, because I can teach someone to have strength in this direction and strength in this direction so that they can move proficiently. But I only get that when I do what? What do you guys do every day? When you practice it, right? And focus on the things that you're trying to accomplish. So again, people always, when they see me up on stage, and the first thing they're going to think of in strength and conditioning is they always think we're going to go to the weight room and do this stuff. None of this stuff has anything to do with the weight room. We're still doing all this potentially on the court with drill work, okay? The other thing to do is set up specific patterns so that people learn eccentric controls, because I need to be able to stop so I can change direction, right? Or at least have some sort of directional change chaos, whereas I'm moving, and that's where the super plays that you get to see, the highlight plays, that's all controlled because the person has the ability to stop and change direction. But we always start by slowing down first before we speed up. Next thing we look at is footwork, and then the next thing we look at is reaction. A lot of times people get the word agility confused. Agility means that there is an external stimulus that you're reacting to. If you run forward and cut to the left, that's not agility. If you run forward and don't know which way you're going to cut, and then there's an opponent that makes you cut in a direction, that's agility. You're responding to an external environment. So here's another thing, just a caveat. This is actually for the older players. It's more of a concern than with the younger players. But what happens is, if you run the same drill over and over and over again without adding a stimulus which has a basketball functional density, they'll get good at the drill. But as soon as I put something into the drill that changes it, what happens to their performance? So they're not agile. It's like learning a dance. If I learn a certain dance and it's always the same, it's very predictable. That's a closed skill. But an open skill is where there's different things that cause me to change the movement pattern. And so with the developmental cycle, these guys, you use a little bit more closed skill. We have very specific patterns that we get down. And then we work on no looking. No looking means this. You guys have seen like footwork ladders, right? The ladders that you can go through. Well, if someone is looking down and their posture is not in a movement application or basketball position ready posture, how useful is that? They might get really fast at it. How useful is that? If I can't do something from that position or use that skill to turn into a basketball play, you're just burning calories. They're better using that for weight loss. So make them basketball reactive, all right? But first, learn the skill, then take their eyes away so that they can get the foot position, because where should their eyes be when they're playing sports? They're either tracking the implement, the ball, or they're tracking a player. One or the other. There also needs kinetic sensory, because a lot of times the player's behind you, right? So I also need to have reaction capabilities from different peripheral sensory components. When we frame it out, this is how we're going to look at doing these things, and this would be like an on-the-court session. Because you don't have as much time in strength and conditioning, like when we get them at the collegiate level in the United States, generally they're defined for 3 to 4 weight training workouts a week, plus 2 conditioning workouts a week, plus practice. So that's at least 5 hours that I would have them in a week. You're not going to have 5 hours of conditioning time, per se, so what we have to do is be strategic. So where we, because we have so much time, have the ability to break it up, others may need to bring things together. The first thing we always do are corrective warm-ups first. We reduce restrictions and reduce the risk for injury. Didn't we say that was number 1 important? Then we add the dynamic warm-up, which presents neural readiness and VO2, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. But by getting someone's VO2 up, that's their oxygen readiness, you can perform at a higher pace, which increases your conditioning. So if I take the athletes and have them start playing without appropriate readiness, their performance generally can decline 10 to 20%. Are you guys okay with losing 10 to 20% on your practice capabilities? Me neither. Then we do plyometrics and ballistics. Then we do change of direction. Now take a look at this. We gross warm-up stuff, then intense stuff, then we get into gross again. Okay? Reason being is, should you be fresh when you do intense activities, or should you be fatigued? Fresh. So if they're getting tired and their movement performance is getting sloppy, stop that activity, move on to the next thing. Another thing that coaches have a tendency to do, well, my thing says I have to do this for this many sets and reps. Read your team. If the team is becoming ineffective at the movement, stop the movement. You can either make it more simple or move on, okay? This is the issue. A lot of times people surprise me in that an important player gets injured, and I'm like, well, I could have told you that was going to happen just by watching how fatigued the person has been over this performance. And so when you start to see overstraining, it's more important to do less so that they can recover. Okay? Like I said, coaching is an educational process. So it doesn't always have to be a physicality, and we can slow down some of those aspects. Also in the conditioning aspects, if you guys did a hard practice, I used to have a basketball coach when I was at Florida International University. I was a strength coach there. He used to do the practice, and I spoke with the sports coach about they can't be overly fatigued because he wanted them to do the strength and conditioning after practice, which from a resource standpoint, it was just the situation that I had to deal with. But he would be mad about the practice, and then what did he do at the end of practice? He made them run back and forth until they almost threw up. Then he sent them to me. So they've got sweat to here. There's no glycogen left. What do you think I did with them? Range of motion drills, stability drills. I can't do weightlifting with people who are absolutely fatigued. That would be irresponsible on my part, because now I would have negative returns for my investment because of the recovery that I would then do to them. Plus, they'd be even more fatigued and have greater problems and increased risk for injury due to the high volume of training. But that's hard for coaches to get through their brains. Because well, my job is to make them stronger. So even though they're tired, I'll work them out even though they're don't ever do that. Over my 20-something years of doing this, that's the one thing when I first started, I wanted to get after it. It didn't matter because I was an effort guy. I don't care. I'll keep going. Because when you have an athlete that's an effort person too, you sometimes have to dial them back. But you need to know when to do those things. Now when I look at it, I've taken my programs, which might have been this long before, and I've reduced them to effective detail-oriented focus, and I have outcomes that are completely predictable. And that's what you want, right? Outcomes that are completely predictable, because then who's in control? Now, take a look at the shortness of this. Training stations are where I do a particular drill without the high intensity based training. If I'm doing technique oriented work, it's 3 to 4 minutes, and when we say time under tension, if you have someone go through a drill and it takes 10 seconds, and you have that drill done enough times that it adds up to 3 minutes, you're done. A lot of times people have this concept that you have to work out for 40, 50 minutes. That's not true. It has nothing to do with the amount of time allotted. It has to always to do with the time under tension, okay? You can see this progresses. Metabolics is how much actual conditioning work you're going to do. It progresses in technique, but the metabolics don't progress. Then my technique gets reduced and I put more emphasis on the metabolics as I get into game shape. This is the key to take away from it. More is always worse, and this will be a key element. Do the math so that you can see how much work is being done, but just always constantly track the signs. If they're looking fatigued, it's a situation and it gets sloppy. If they're doing things sloppy, all they're going to get good at is doing it sloppy, and the risk for problems is going to increase. The other thing, which Dr. Shiro talked about, I always do my instruction based on the concept that my athletes are hydrated and have consumed enough carbohydrates in the day before. Most importantly is what you eat directly after practice and directly after working out. That's the most important time of the day. Because what you eat directly after practice and what you eat directly after working out, maybe the same thing, will determine the amount of energy that goes into your muscles for the next practice. Eating before a practice does not put energy into your muscles. That's a fallacy. Consuming before practice will put energy into your blood and will put energy into your liver. Very limited energy into your muscles. So if you have a hard practice, within 45 minutes, they need to get carbohydrates in their system. And that will get them ready for the next practice. That will enhance the recovery. So recovery is threefold. Sugar immediately following, carbohydrates, whatever, following your practice. Adequate hydration throughout the day, and appropriate sleep. If you don't have those three things, you won't recover. And if you don't recover, you're starting negative, and it eventually goes into overtraining. Okay? I think that was the last slide that I have for you. And I know I told Michael I would end a little bit earlier, but that's just a sample. This forum makes it a little bit easier to ask questions, but I will take questions tomorrow for sure. I just don't know what type of setup we're going to be in. But based on what I said, or if you have something that has nothing to do with what I said, that might be worth talking about too. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, in the last part you say to recover the best way is carbohydrate.
Yep.
Nothing protein.
Well, it works like this, and you can write this down. I'll write it down. How about that? This is within 45 minutes. As soon as they are able to consume food, following practice or exercise, they need to consume food. The ideal mixture is 60 grams of carbohydrates and up to 20 grams of protein. And I'll tell you why. The carbohydrates are important. If it is a very simple carbohydrate like glucose, it is absorbed at a rate of 1 gram per minute, which means this is how much can be absorbed over the next hour. Okay, so that's where the relevance comes in. That goes right into your muscles. The 20 grams of protein help facilitate a slight insulin response that drives that into the muscles at a faster rate. It can also be done without the protein, so this is the most important, but this is enhanced with protein. So that combination. When I put these two things together, this is about a 320 kilocalorie meal. Here's another thing that I suggest that you do, is you calculate, and this is not hard. There's calculators that you can do just based on the basketball practices. And you figure out total calories consumed during your practice. And that should all be put in within 4 hours. What you just did there is the energy you will have for tomorrow's practice. Even if they have a good breakfast before practice, because of the nature of the way the human body works, much of that energy will be stored in the liver and in the blood. Some will go into the muscles, but not enough to satisfy the demands of physical activity. So the body works like this. When the muscles get drained, they reach low levels. They cause signaling effect that cause them to suck all the energy back up. And you can actually, by making sure you have adequate carbohydrates, that you have just as much, if not more, energy the following day, depending on your timing. Protein is less important. Protein is needed throughout the day for recovery, but protein does not give you energy for work. So, your physical activity is carbohydrates. Your muscle recovery is based on protein. So immediately following physical activity, you need what you just lost, and that's carbohydrates. Okay? I'm sorry, with fats? Fats can be distributed appropriately, but there's one time I don't want any fats, and that's here. The problem with the fats, immediately follow, you can have some, but if you put too much fat into the system, immediately following your practices or physical exertion, it slows down the sugar. I need the sugar to get in immediately. So actually, one of the most popular, wait till you hear this, maybe you know. One of the most popular post-exercise drinks that's used for supplementation in the US is chocolate milk. It has demonstrated better efficacy against all the other supplements. And chocolate milk, a full serving of chocolate milk has the perfect mix because one serving has 27 grams of carbohydrates and it has 8 grams of protein. And so if we drink 2 servings, you essentially get just about your 60 grams and just about your 20 grams. So some of the companies, have you heard of Muscle Milk? I don't know if you heard of that. That's what they're trying to copy, is a replication of that. But you want simple carbohydrates. So another common one that people will consume is like a bagel or a bread product with low-fat peanut butter, or a bread product with jam. Those types of things that can get into your system very quickly. Do I have any other questions? Everyone's with me on understanding when I talk tomorrow about the developmental process and how it might seem a little bit more simplistic. But what I would rather do is have 4 drills which every person can perform to mastery, than have 10 drills that 50% of them don't do well. Okay? And that's where the focus will be tomorrow. So we'll do injury prevention techniques tomorrow, and we'll also do mobility-based things in the different vectors. So you'll take those of you that do workouts, it might look different than what you've seen in the past, but that's because this is specific to sport. It's not specific to getting big muscles. Cool? Thank you.